In the vast wilderness of Montana, where the horizon stretches endlessly and nature rules with an iron fist, some encounters test the very limits of human survival. What happens when a mother's protective instinct meets the raw, untamed power of hundreds of thundering bison? What happens when hope seems lost and salvation comes from the most unexpected source? This is not just another wilderness survival story. This is the account of Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old widow carrying her infant son through territory that belonged to creatures far more powerful than any human. This is the story of how one man's extraordinary connection with nature became the thin line between life and death for a desperate mother and her child. Some say what happened that day in September 1887 was impossible. Others call it a miracle. But for Sarah Mitchell, clutching her baby as thousands of pounds of muscle and horn bore down on them, it was simply the moment when she learned that sometimes, when all seems lost, help can come from places you never imagined. The American frontier was unforgiving, but it also held mysteries that challenged everything people thought they knew about the relationship between humans and the wild. This is one of those mysteries lived by real people, witnessed by those who could barely believe their own eyes. The morning sun painted the Montana grasslands gold as Sarah Mitchell adjusted the leather sling that held her 6-month-old son, Thomas, against her chest. The baby slept peacefully, unaware that his mother's hands trembled slightly as she guided their horse through the endless sea of prairie grass. 3 weeks had passed since they left the settlement of Billings, and the weight of her decision pressed heavier on her shoulders with each passing mile. Sarah's husband, James, had died 6 months earlier in a mining accident, leaving her alone with their newborn son and crushing debt. The small house they had called home was lost to creditors, and Sarah faced a choice that no young mother should have to make. She could stay in Billings, working whatever job she could find while relying on the charity of neighbors who had their own struggles, or she could accept her sister Margaret's invitation to join her family in their homestead near Great Falls. The letter from Margaret had arrived like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "Come to us, Sarah," Margaret had written in her careful script. "Robert has done well with the ranch, and we have room for you and the baby. Thomas needs family, and you need a fresh start where James's ghost doesn't haunt every corner." The decision had been agonizing, but ultimately clear. Sarah sold everything she could, bought a sturdy horse named Belle, supplies for the journey, and set out across the vast Montana territory with nothing but hope and determination. The route was well traveled by settlers and traders, following natural landmarks and seasonal water sources. What should have been a straightforward journey of 10 days had stretched into 3 weeks due to unexpected storms and Sarah's inexperience with wilderness travel. Now, as Belle picked her way carefully across a particularly rocky stretch of terrain, Sarah began to worry that she had made a terrible mistake. Her food supplies were running dangerously low, and she had seen no other travelers for 3 days. The landscape around them seemed to stretch forever, rolling hills covered in tall grass that whispered secrets in the wind. In the distance, she could see dark shapes that might have been rocks, trees, or something else entirely. Thomas stirred against her chest, making the soft sounds that meant he would soon wake hungry. Sarah reached for the water bottle at her side, noting with growing alarm how light it felt. The stream she had been following had veered away from her intended path 2 days ago, and she had been relying on the small springs and seasonal pools that dotted the landscape. Some had been dry, others barely more than muddy puddles that Belle refused to drink from. As if sensing her thoughts, the horse snorted and tossed her head. Belle had been a good choice, strong and steady, with the kind of intelligence that came from generations of horses bred for frontier life. James had always said that a good horse was worth 3 men when traveling through wild country, and Sarah had come to understand what he meant. Belle seemed to sense danger before Sarah could identify it, often stopping or changing direction for reasons that only became clear later. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature rose with it. Sarah removed her heavy wool coat and tied it behind the saddle, grateful for the lighter cotton dress beneath. Thomas was awake now, his bright blue eyes taking in the world around him with a serious expression that always reminded Sarah of his father. She offered him water from a small cup, watching as he drank eagerly. It was then that Belle suddenly stopped, her ears pricked forward and her entire body tense with alertness. Sarah followed the horse's gaze and felt her heart skip a beat. The dark shapes she had noticed in the distance were moving, and as her eyes adjusted to the glare of the afternoon sun, she realized what she was looking at. Bison, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, spread across the valley ahead like a living carpet of brown and black. They were grazing peacefully, but their sheer number was overwhelming. Sarah had heard about the great herds that roamed the territory, but seeing them in person was something entirely different. Each animal was massive, some standing 6 feet tall at the shoulder, with heads that seemed too large for their bodies and horns that gleamed in the sunlight. For a moment, Sarah simply stared in wonder. These were the creatures that had ruled the Great Plains for thousands of years, following ancient migration routes that older than any human memory. Native tribes had built entire civilizations around their movements, and even now, as settlers and railroads pushed further into their territory, the bison continued their timeless journey across the grasslands. But wonder quickly gave way to practical concern. The herd blocked her intended path, and from what she could see, they extended far to both the east and west. Going around them would add days to her journey, days she couldn't afford with her supplies running low. Yet attempting to ride through the herd seemed impossibly dangerous. Belle shifted nervously beneath her, clearly uncomfortable with the proximity of so many large animals. Sarah dismounted and led the horse to a small rise where they could observe the herd while remaining hidden behind a cluster of rocks. She needed time to think, to plan a course of action that wouldn't put Thomas in danger. The bison seemed calm enough, focused on grazing and paying no attention to the mother and child watching from a distance. Sarah had heard that the great herds could be peaceful if left undisturbed, but she had also heard stories of stampedes that could crush anything in their path. The animals were unpredictable, capable of explosive movement despite their size. Thomas began to fuss, and Sarah realized it was time for his feeding. She found a comfortable spot among the rocks and settled in to nurse him, keeping one eye on the herd below. The baby latched on eagerly, and Sarah felt the familiar tug of maternal love that had sustained her through the darkest days after James's death. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them for Thomas. He deserved a chance at a good life, the kind of life that Margaret and Robert could provide on their successful ranch. As she fed Thomas, Sarah noticed movement at the edge of the herd. A lone figure on horseback was approaching the bison, moving with a confidence that seemed impossible given the circumstances. The rider was still too far away for Sarah to make out details, but something about their posture and the way they moved suggested this was someone who knew what they were doing. The stranger rode closer to the herd than Sarah would have thought possible, and remarkably, the bison didn't seem alarmed by the presence. If anything, they appeared to acknowledge the rider, some of the animals lifting their massive heads briefly before returning to their grazing. Sarah watched in fascination as the figure moved along the edge of the herd, occasionally stopping as if studying something. Belle whinnied softly, and Sarah realized the wind had shifted, carrying their scent toward the herd. Several of the nearest bison looked up, their dark eyes scanning the landscape until they spotted the horse and riders on the hill. Sarah held her breath, but the animals seemed more curious than alarmed. They watched for a few moments before returning to their business. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Sarah made her decision. She couldn't wait any longer. The mysterious rider had disappeared, moving beyond her line of sight, and the herd showed no signs of moving on. If she was going to attempt to skirt around them, she needed to start now while there was still daylight to guide her. She secured Thomas in his sling, gathered her supplies, and mounted Belle. The horse was still nervous, but responded to Sarah's gentle guidance as they began to descend from their hiding place. Sarah chose a path that would take them well wide of the herd, adding miles to their journey, but hopefully avoiding any confrontation with the massive animals. For the first hour, everything went according to plan. They maintained a respectful distance from the bison while making steady progress toward the north. Thomas dozed against Sarah's chest, lulled by the rhythmic motion of Belle's gait. The afternoon sun felt warm on Sarah's back, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to feel optimistic about reaching Margaret's ranch. But as they crested a low hill, Sarah realized they had a problem. The herd was much larger than she had initially estimated, extending far further north than she had expected. What she had thought was a manageable detour was turning into a major deviation from her planned route. Worse, the sun was sinking lower, and she was running out of daylight. Belle began to show signs of fatigue, her pace slowing despite Sarah's gentle encouragement. The horse had been carrying both riders for hours across difficult terrain, and even her sturdy constitution had limits. Sarah knew they would need to find a place to camp soon, but the thought of spending the night so close to the massive herd filled her with anxiety. As if responding to her thoughts, a low rumble began to emanate from the direction of the bison. At first, Sarah thought it might be distant thunder, but the sound was too constant, too rhythmic. She turned in her saddle and felt her blood turn to ice. The herd was moving. What had been a peaceful gathering of grazing animals was transforming into something entirely different. The bison at the rear of the herd were beginning to move forward, creating a ripple effect that spread through the entire group. The rumble Sarah heard was the sound of thousands of hooves beginning to pound against the earth. Belle sensed the change immediately, her ears flattening against her head as she pranced nervously. Sarah tried to calm the horse while scanning the landscape for any kind of shelter or high ground. The evening light made it difficult to judge distances, but she could see that they were in relatively open country with few options for protection. The movement of the herd was picking up speed, and Sarah realized with growing horror that the bison weren't simply migrating. Something had spooked them, and they were beginning to stampede. The rumble was becoming a roar, and the ground beneath Belle's hooves was starting to vibrate from the impact of thousands of running animals. Thomas began to cry, perhaps sensing his mother's fear or reacting to the noise and vibration. Sarah held him tighter while trying to control Belle, who was becoming increasingly difficult to manage as her instincts told her to run from the approaching danger. The herd was spreading out as it moved, covering a front that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. Sarah realized with sick certainty that they were directly in the path of the stampede, and Belle, despite her strength and speed, could never outrun the charging bison. The animals could reach speeds of 35 miles per hour when running in fear, and their endurance was legendary. Panic threatened to overwhelm Sarah as she looked desperately for any option, any possibility of escape. The landscape that had seemed so beautiful just hours ago now appeared as a death trap, offering no protection from the tons of muscle and horn bearing down on them. But then, through the dust and chaos beginning to rise from the stampeding herd, Sarah saw something that made her wonder if fear was causing her to hallucinate. A lone rider was moving parallel to the approaching stampede, not fleeing from it, but somehow keeping pace with the leading animals. The figure seemed impossibly calm, guiding their horse with subtle movements while staying just ahead of the charging bison. As impossible as it seemed, the rider appeared to be leading the herd, directing its movement with gestures that Sarah could barely make out through the growing clouds of dust. It was as if the person possessed some kind of supernatural influence over the wild animals, a connection that defied everything Sarah thought she knew about the relationship between humans and nature. The sound of the stampede was now overwhelming, a thunder that seemed to shake the very earth. Belle was fighting against Sarah's control, every instinct telling the horse to run. Thomas was screaming, his cries lost in the cacophony of thousands of animals running in terror. And still the mysterious rider moved ahead of the herd, a lone figure against a backdrop of chaos that seemed to hold some kind of power over forces that should have been beyond any human influence. Sarah found herself staring at this impossible sight, even as death approached in the form of countless tons of panicked animals. The dust cloud was now so thick that Sarah could barely see beyond Belle's ears, and the sound of the approaching stampede made it impossible to think clearly. She held Thomas against her chest and whispered a prayer that seemed inadequate against the magnitude of their danger. This was how their story would end, she realized with odd clarity. Not in the comfort of Margaret's ranch, but here in the wilderness, crushed beneath the hooves of creatures that had ruled these plains long before humans arrived to challenge their dominion. But as the leading edge of the stampede bore down on them, something extraordinary happened that would change Sarah's understanding of what was possible in the wild places of the world. The mysterious rider burst through the wall of dust like something from a fever dream, materializing so suddenly that Sarah barely had time to register what was happening. One moment she was alone with Thomas and Belle, facing certain death beneath thousands of stampeding hooves, and the next a powerful hand was reaching down from horseback, grabbing Belle's bridle with an authority that cut through the chaos. "Hold tight to your baby." The voice that cut through the thunderous noise was deep and commanding, speaking English with an accent Sarah couldn't immediately place. The stranger's horse was unlike any she had ever seen, a magnificent animal that seemed completely unaffected by the approaching stampede. Where Belle trembled and fought against her terror, this horse moved with liquid grace, responding to its rider's slightest touch. Without waiting for Sarah's response, the stranger began to guide Belle away from the direct path of the stampede, but not in the direction Sarah would have expected. Instead of fleeing perpendicular to the herd's movement, they were angling toward a rocky outcropping that seemed impossibly close to the charging animals. "Trust me," the rider shouted over the deafening noise, and something in that voice made Sarah relax her death grip on Belle's reins. She got her first clear look at their rescuer as they rode side by side toward what looked like certain destruction. He was a man of perhaps 30 years, with weathered skin that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors and dark hair that hung past his shoulders. His clothes were a mixture of traditional frontier wear and Native American elements, leather pants, and a cotton shirt decorated with beadwork that caught the late afternoon light. But it was his eyes that captured Sarah's attention, dark and intense with a depth that seemed to hold secrets about the wild world around them. Most remarkable of all was his composure. While Sarah felt overwhelmed by terror and Belle shook with fear, this man moved through the chaos as if he belonged to it, as natural as the wind or the grass beneath their horses' hooves. His horse, a beautiful painted stallion with distinctive markings, seemed to share its rider's supernatural calm. The rocky outcropping ahead looked pitifully small against the wall of approaching animals. But as they drew closer, Sarah realized it was larger than it had first appeared. The rocks formed a natural shelter, with an opening just wide enough for the horses, but too narrow for the massive bison to follow. The stranger guided them toward this opening with precise timing, arriving just as the leading edge of the stampede thundered past. The noise was indescribable as hundreds of bison poured around the rocky shelter. The ground shook so violently that Sarah feared the rocks themselves might collapse, and the dust was so thick that breathing became difficult. Thomas screamed continuously, his tiny voice lost in the greater cacophony, and Sarah held him so tightly that she worried she might hurt him. But they were alive. Against all odds, they had found safety in the eye of a storm that should have destroyed them. The mysterious rider dismounted and moved to check on Belle, running his hands along her flanks and speaking to her in a language Sarah didn't recognize. The horse gradually calmed under his touch, her wild eyes losing some of their panic. "Your horse is strong," the man said to Sarah, his voice now quiet enough for normal conversation as the main body of the herd passed by their shelter. "She has good instincts. That's why she survived." Sarah was still too stunned to respond coherently. She dismounted on shaking legs and tried to comfort Thomas, who was gradually settling down as the noise level decreased. The man watched her with those intense eyes, and Sarah found herself wondering who he was and how he had appeared at precisely the right moment to save their lives. "I'm called Daniel Walking Bear," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "My grandfather was French-Canadian, my grandmother was Blackfoot. I was tracking this herd when I saw you on the hill." The name suited him, Sarah thought. There was something about the way he moved that reminded her of the few Native Americans she had encountered in Billings, a fluid grace that suggested perfect comfort in the natural world. But there was something more, something that went beyond cultural differences or frontier skills. "How did you know?" Sarah asked, finally finding her voice. "How did you know they would stampede?" Daniel smiled, and for the first time since their rescue began, his expression softened. "The wind changed," he said simply. "It carried the scent of wolves from the north. The herd leaders could smell them, and they knew danger was coming." Sarah looked around at the chaos still swirling outside their shelter. Even now, stragglers were passing by, massive animals that seemed large enough to demolish their hiding place with a casual brush of their shoulders. Yet the bison flowed around the rocks like water around a stone, following the path of least resistance. "But how did you control them?" she pressed. "I saw you riding alongside them, and it looked like you were directing where they went." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying Thomas with an expression that mixed curiosity and something else Sarah couldn't identify. When he spoke, his words came slowly, as if he was choosing them carefully. "My grandmother taught me the old ways," he said. "The Blackfoot have lived with the buffalo for more generations than anyone can count. We learned their language, their patterns, their spirit. When you understand an animal completely, you can sometimes influence its behavior." It was an explanation, but Sarah sensed it wasn't the whole truth. There had been something almost supernatural about the way the bison had responded to Daniel's presence, something that went beyond mere understanding or frontier skills. The rumble of the stampede was gradually fading as the herd moved past them toward the south. Dust still hung thick in the air, but the violent shaking of the ground had settled into a steady vibration that would continue until the last animal had passed. "You are traveling alone," Daniel observed, though it sounded more like a question. Sarah nodded, suddenly, aware of how vulnerable she must appear. A young woman with an infant, traveling alone through territory that could kill experienced frontiersmen, must seem incredibly foolish to someone with Daniel's obvious expertise. "My husband died," she said simply. "I'm taking my son to live with my sister near Great Falls." Daniel nodded without expression, but Sarah caught something in his eyes that might have been sympathy. "Great Falls is still many days from here," he said. "The country between here and there can be dangerous for someone traveling alone." It wasn't said as a criticism, just a statement of fact, but Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks anyway. She was acutely aware of her inexperience, of the mistakes she had made that had led to this dangerous encounter. "I had no choice," she said, more defensively than she intended. "I couldn't stay in Billings, and I couldn't afford to hire a guide." "I understand," Daniel said quietly. "Sometimes the spirit moves us to do things that seem impossible." Thomas had finally settled down and was looking around with the bright curiosity that characterized his waking hours. His gaze fixed on Daniel with an intensity that seemed unusual for such a young baby, and Sarah noticed that Daniel was studying her son with equal attention. "He has strong eyes," Daniel said. "Like he can see things others cannot." It was an odd comment, but before Sarah could respond, Daniel moved to the opening of their shelter and peered out at the passing herd. "They will be moving for another hour," he said. "Then we can continue." "We?" Sarah asked. Daniel turned back to her, and for the first time since their meeting, he looked uncertain. "You cannot travel this country alone with a child," he said. "Not safely. I was heading north when I found you. I could guide you to your sister's ranch." The offer was unexpected and generous, but Sarah felt she had to refuse. She had no money to pay a guide, and accepting charity from a stranger seemed wrong, even after he had saved their lives. "I can't afford to pay you," she said. "I didn't ask for payment," Daniel replied. "The spirits brought me to you at the moment you needed help. That was not coincidence." Sarah didn't know what to make of this explanation, but she found herself wanting to accept his offer. The thought of continuing alone through the wilderness, especially after what had just happened, filled her with dread. But accepting help from a man she had just met, a man who seemed to possess abilities that defied rational explanation, felt like stepping into unknown territory. "Why would you help us?" she asked. Daniel was quiet for a long time, watching Thomas with that same intense attention. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he was working through something in his own mind. "I lost my family 3 years ago," he said. "Disease came to our village, and many died. My wife, my daughter, my son. I have been alone since then, moving through the wilderness because I could not bear to stay in places that reminded me of them." Sarah felt a pang of sympathy for this man who had experienced losses that made her own grief seem small. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "When I saw you with your child, facing the stampede, something in my heart awakened that had been sleeping since the sickness took my family. Perhaps helping you is part of my own healing." The last of the stragglers were passing by their shelter now, and the dust was beginning to settle. Daniel moved to his horse and began checking the animal's gear with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years in the wilderness. "The decision is yours," he said without looking at Sarah. "But if you choose to travel with me, we should leave soon. There's a good camping place 3 hours north of here with water and grass for the horses." Sarah looked at Thomas, who was now sleeping peacefully in her arms despite the chaos they had just survived. She thought about the long days of travel still ahead, the dangers she couldn't even imagine, the possibility of making another mistake that might cost her son his life. "All right," she said. "We'll travel together." Daniel nodded as if he had expected this answer. "Good. Your horse needs water, and so do you. There's a spring just behind these rocks." As if to prove his point, Belle whinnied softly and began moving toward the back of their shelter, following some scent that promised the water she desperately needed. Sarah followed, marveling at how Daniel seemed to know exactly what resources were available in this seemingly barren landscape. The spring was small but clear, bubbling up from between the rocks to form a pool no larger than a wash basin. Belle drank gratefully while Sarah refilled her water bottles and splashed her face with the cool liquid. The simple act of cleaning away the dust and grime from their desperate flight felt like a ritual of rebirth. "How did you know about this spring?" Sarah asked. "The rocks," Daniel replied. "They have the look of places where water runs underground. And the vegetation is slightly different here, greener." It was another example of the kind of knowledge that had kept him alive in this harsh country, the ability to read signs that were invisible to Sarah's inexperienced eyes. She was beginning to understand just how much she didn't know about wilderness travel, and how fortunate she was to have encountered someone with Daniel's skills. As they prepared to leave their shelter, Sarah caught Daniel watching Thomas again with that same intense attention. There was something in his expression that made her uncomfortable, not threatening, but deeply focused, as if he was seeing something about her son that she couldn't perceive. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No, nothing wrong. But Your son is special in some way. I can sense it. What do you mean? Some children are born with gifts, Daniel said carefully. The ability to see beyond the ordinary world, to understand things that others cannot. Your son has that look. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. That's impossible. He's just a baby. Age has nothing to do with it, Daniel replied. Some gifts are present from birth, waiting to develop as the child grows. It was a conversation that made Sarah deeply uncomfortable, touching on beliefs and possibilities that challenged her practical frontier upbringing. But before she could respond, Daniel had moved to his horse and was preparing to mount. "We should go," he said. "The light is fading, and we have distance to cover." As they rode away from their shelter, Sarah looked back at the trampled ground where thousands of bison had passed just hours before. The experience already seemed like something from a dream, too dramatic and unlikely to have really happened. But the evidence was there in the churned earth and the lingering scent of dust and wild animals. Daniel rode slightly ahead, choosing their path with the same supernatural confidence he had displayed during the rescue. His painted horse moved with sure feet across terrain that looked identical in every direction to Sarah's inexperienced eyes, but Daniel navigated as if following a map only he could see. The evening light was fading rapidly, painting the grasslands in shades of gold and amber that reminded Sarah of the wheat fields near her childhood home in Ohio. For the first time since beginning her journey, she felt something approaching peace. She was still far from her destination, still dependent on the kindness of a stranger, but she was alive and Thomas was safe. As if sensing her thoughts, Daniel turned in his saddle to check on them. "How are you managing?" he asked. "Better," Sarah replied, and realized she meant it. Daniel nodded and returned his attention to their path, but Sarah caught something in his expression that suggested he was pleased by her answer. They rode on through the gathering darkness, two strangers bound together by extraordinary circumstances, carrying secrets and sorrows that would slowly reveal themselves in the days to come. The campsite Daniel led them to was everything he had promised and more. Nestled in a small valley protected from the wind, with a clear stream running through grass so green it looked almost artificial in the moonlight, it seemed like an oasis after the harsh landscape they had been crossing. Sarah dismounted gratefully, her body aching from hours in the saddle and the tension of their harrowing escape. Daniel worked with quiet efficiency to establish their camp, his movements sure and economical in the darkness. He seemed to need no light beyond what the stars and half-moon provided, moving around their small campsite as if he could see perfectly. Within minutes, he had unsaddled both horses, hobbled them near the stream where they could drink and graze, and gathered materials for a small fire. "Will it be safe to have a fire?" Sarah asked, thinking of wolves, bears, and the other dangers that might be drawn to light in the wilderness. "Yes," Daniel replied simply. "We are protected here." It was another of his mysterious pronouncements, the kind of statement that suggested knowledge beyond what any normal person should possess. But Sarah was learning to trust Daniel's instincts. Everything he had told her so far had proven accurate, from the location of the spring at their rocky shelter to the promise of this perfect campsite. As the small fire caught and began to cast dancing shadows around their camp, Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Thomas was sleeping peacefully against her chest, worn out by the day's excitement, but apparently none the worse for their brush with death. She could hardly believe that just a few hours ago, they had been facing a charging herd of bison with no hope of escape. "Tell me about your family," Sarah said, as they settled beside the fire with cups of coffee made from her dwindling supplies. She was curious about this man who had appeared so dramatically in their hour of need, and something about the firelight and the peaceful setting made personal conversation seem natural. Daniel was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames with an expression that suggested he was seeing more than just burning wood. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "My wife's name was Morningstar," he said. "She was Blackfoot like my grandmother, but from a different band. We met at a trading post near Fort Benton when I was 23. She was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, but it was her laugh that captured my heart. She could find joy in the smallest things, a bird's song, the way sunlight looked on water, the smell of sage after rain." He paused, and Sarah could see the pain in his eyes. We had 5 years together before the sickness came. 5 years that felt like a lifetime, and yet passed too quickly. "What was the sickness?" Sarah asked gently. "Smallpox," Daniel replied. "It came through the territory like a fire, killing whole families, whole villages. Morningstar tried to help the others who were sick, even after she began showing symptoms herself. She said it was her duty as a healer." Sarah felt her throat tighten. She had heard about the devastating epidemics that swept through Native American communities, diseases that European settlers carried, but that proved deadly to people with no natural immunity. Entire tribes had been wiped out by illnesses that were merely inconvenient to white populations. "You said you had children?" she asked. Daniel nodded, his eyes still fixed on the fire. "A daughter, Little Hawk, who was 6. A son, Running Wolf, who was 4. They died within 2 days of each other, and Morningstar followed them a week later. I was the only one in our family who survived." The grief in his voice was still raw, even after 3 years. Sarah could understand that pain, the way loss could hollow out everything that had once given life meaning. Her own grief for James was still sharp, but she had Thomas to focus on, a reason to keep moving forward. Daniel had lost everyone. "I'm so sorry," she said, and meant it deeply. "For a long time, I wished I had died with them," Daniel continued. "I couldn't understand why the spirits had chosen to take them and leave me alone. I lived in the wilderness because I couldn't bear to be around other people, couldn't stand their sympathy or their attempts to help me heal." He looked up from the fire and met Sarah's eyes. "But today when I saw you and your son facing the stampede, something changed inside me. For the first time since my family died, I felt like I had a purpose again." Thomas stirred in Sarah's arms, making the small sounds that meant he was waking up. As she prepared to feed him, Sarah thought about the strange circumstances that had brought them together. 2 people who had lost their spouses, traveling through a wilderness that seemed determined to test their will to survive, finding each other at exactly the moment when help was most needed. "Do you really believe the spirits brought us together?" she asked. Daniel considered this carefully. "My grandmother used to say that everything happens for a reason, even things that seem random or cruel. She said the spirits are always working to maintain balance in the world, bringing together people who need each other, creating opportunities for healing and growth." It was a philosophy that challenged Sarah's practical Protestant upbringing, but after the events of the day, she found herself open to possibilities she would have dismissed just hours earlier. There was something about Daniel that defied rational explanation, abilities that seemed to go beyond normal frontier skills. "What you did with the bison today," she said, "that wasn't just understanding animal behavior, was it?" Daniel was quiet for a long time, and Sarah wondered if she had overstepped some boundary by asking. But when he finally spoke, his words came with the weight of confession. "My grandmother was what your people would call a medicine woman," he said. "She had abilities that went beyond the ordinary world. She could communicate with animals, influence the weather, see things that were hidden from others. Before she died, she taught me some of her knowledge." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard stories about such people, though she had always dismissed them as frontier legends or Native American superstition. But after witnessing Daniel's impossible control over the stampeding bison, she found herself reevaluating everything she thought she knew about the world. "Is that why you think Thomas is special?" she asked. Daniel looked at the baby, who was now awake and watching the flames with bright, alert eyes. Children who are born with gifts often recognize others who have similar abilities, he said. Your son watches me the way my daughter used to watch my grandmother, as if he can see something others cannot. The idea that her infant son might possess some kind of supernatural ability was disturbing to Sarah, but she couldn't deny that Thomas did seem unusually alert and aware for a 6-month-old baby. He often stared at things that weren't there, as if following movements invisible to adult eyes, and he had always been remarkably calm in situations that should have frightened him. What does that mean for his future? Sarah asked. It means he will have choices to make as he grows up, Daniel replied. He can learn to develop his gifts, or he can choose to ignore them and live an ordinary life. Both paths have their rewards and their costs. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down and listening to the night sounds of the prairie. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and others answered from different directions. The sound should have been frightening, but somehow it felt natural and even comforting, like voices of the wilderness welcoming them to this temporary refuge. As the night progressed, Daniel shared more stories about his life before tragedy struck. He told Sarah about learning to track animals from his Blackfoot grandmother, about the French-Canadian trapper grandfather who had taught him to read, and about the years he had spent moving between the white and native worlds, never quite belonging fully to either. In return, Sarah found herself talking about her life with James, their dreams of building something permanent in the Montana Territory, the way those dreams had crumbled when he died in the mine collapse. She spoke about her fears for Thomas's future, her worries about being a burden on Margaret and Robert, her determination to build a new life despite the obstacles. Daniel listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that showed he understood the weight of the choices she had made. There was something healing about speaking honestly to someone who had faced similar losses, who understood the way grief could reshape a person's entire world. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with a cool breeze that promised good traveling weather. Daniel was awake before sunrise, checking on the horses and preparing for another day on the trail. Sarah woke to find him sitting cross-legged beside the dying embers of their fire, so still and focused that he seemed to be in some kind of trance. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Daniel opened his eyes and smiled. "I was listening to the land," he said. "Today will be a good day for traveling. No storms, no dangerous animals in our path." It was another example of his mysterious abilities, this capacity to sense things that were beyond normal human perception. But Sarah was learning to accept such statements as simply part of who Daniel was, no more unusual than his skill with horses or his knowledge of hidden water sources. They traveled for 3 more days through country that gradually became more familiar to Sarah. Daniel guided them along routes that avoided the worst terrain while keeping them moving steadily toward Great Falls. Each night, he found perfect campsites with water and shelter, and each day, they made good progress without encountering any of the dangers that had plagued Sarah's solo journey. On the 4th morning, Sarah woke to see smoke rising in the distance, the thin line that meant human habitation. Her heart leaped with excitement and relief as she realized they were approaching the end of their journey together. "That's Margaret's ranch," Daniel confirmed, following her gaze. "We'll be there by afternoon." The news should have filled Sarah with pure joy, but she found herself feeling unexpectedly sad about the prospect of parting from Daniel. Over the past few days, she had grown accustomed to his quiet strength, his seemingly infinite knowledge of the wilderness, and the sense of safety his presence provided. The thought of continuing her life without his protection was daunting. "What will you do after you leave us at the ranch?" she asked as they broke camp for the last time. Daniel secured his pack behind his saddle and mounted the painted horse that had carried him through so many adventures. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "For 3 years, I've been wandering without direction, moving from place to place because I couldn't bear to stay anywhere that reminded me of my family. But Helping you has given me a sense of purpose I had forgotten was possible." They rode the final miles in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey that was ending and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Thomas seemed to sense the approaching change, staying awake and alert as he watched the landscape roll by. Margaret's ranch appeared gradually over the rolling hills, first as a collection of buildings too small to make out clearly, then as a well-organized homestead with a main house, barn, corrals, and several outbuildings. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Sarah could see cattle grazing in nearby pastures. It looked prosperous and welcoming, exactly the kind of place where she and Thomas could build new life. Margaret emerged from the house as they approached, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun to identify the approaching riders. Sarah felt tears of relief and joy as she recognized her sister's familiar figure. Margaret was older by 3 years and had always been the more practical of the two, but her face lit up with genuine happiness as she realized who was approaching. "Sarah," Margaret called, running toward them with a speed that seemed impossible given her normally dignified demeanor. "Oh, Sarah, we were so worried. You should have been here weeks ago." Sarah dismounted and found herself enveloped in her sister's embrace, Thomas squeezed safely between them. For the first time since James's death, she felt like she was truly safe, surrounded by family and the promise of stability. "I had some difficulties on the trail," Sarah said, glancing toward Daniel, who had dismounted but remained at a respectful distance. "This is Daniel Walking Bear. He saved our lives and guided us here." Margaret looked at Daniel with the assessing gaze of a frontier woman who had learned to judge people quickly and accurately. Whatever she saw must have impressed her, because her expression warmed considerably. "Then, we owe you a debt we can never repay," she said formally. "Please, you must stay for dinner at least, and you're welcome to spend the night if you're traveling on." Daniel inclined his head politely. "You are very kind, but I should be moving on soon." "Nonsense," Margaret said firmly. "Sarah, bring him inside. Robert will want to hear about your journey, and we need to properly thank the man who brought you home safely." The next few hours passed in a blur of introductions, explanations, and reunion. Robert proved to be everything Margaret's letters had promised, a solid, reliable man who had built a successful ranch through hard work and careful planning. He listened to Sarah's account of their journey with growing amazement, asking Daniel detailed questions about the Bison stampede and their route across the territory. "You have remarkable skills," Robert told Daniel over dinner. "I've lived in this country for 8 years, and I've never seen anyone who could read the land the way you do." Daniel accepted the compliment gracefully, but remained modestly quiet about his abilities. Sarah noticed that he downplayed the more supernatural aspects of their rescue, describing his actions in terms that emphasized practical knowledge rather than the almost mystical connection to the bison herd that she had witnessed. As evening approached, Daniel announced his intention to leave, despite Margaret and Robert's repeated invitations to stay longer. Sarah walked with him to where his horse waited, feeling the same sadness that had troubled her all day. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You saved our lives, and you asked for nothing in return." Daniel was checking his horse's gear, but he looked up at her words. "You gave me something more valuable than anything you could have paid me with," he said. "You reminded me what it feels like to have a purpose, to be needed by someone other than myself." Thomas was sleeping in Sarah's arms, peaceful and content after the excitement of arrival at the ranch. Daniel reached out to gently touch the baby's forehead, and Sarah was startled to see tears in the man's eyes. "Take care of him," Daniel said softly. "He is destined for extraordinary things." "Will we ever see you again?" Sarah asked. Daniel mounted his horse and gathered the reins. For a moment, his composed facade slipped, and Sarah saw the loneliness that still haunted him despite their shared adventure. The spirits work in mysterious ways, he said. If we're meant to meet again, we will. He rode away into the gathering darkness, and Sarah watched until she could no longer distinguish his silhouette from the shadows of the prairie. She felt as if she was losing something important, though she couldn't quite define what. Margaret appeared beside her, drawn by the sound of horse hooves departing. He's an unusual man, she observed. Robert thinks he has Indian blood. His grandmother was Blackfoot, Sarah confirmed. But there's more to him than that. Margaret, some of the things he could do, they weren't natural. Her sister studied her face in the dim light from the house windows. The frontier changes people, she said finally. Sometimes it brings out abilities we never knew we had. Sometimes it connects us to things we don't understand. It was a more philosophical response than Sarah had expected from her practical sister. But perhaps life on a remote ranch had taught Margaret things about the mysterious aspects of the wilderness that couldn't be learned in more settled places. The weeks that followed passed quickly as Sarah settled into her new life. Margaret and Robert welcomed her and Thomas with genuine warmth, making room in their home and their hearts for the displaced family members. Sarah found work helping Margaret with the domestic tasks of running the ranch, while Thomas thrived in the stable, loving environment his aunt and uncle provided. But Sarah often found herself thinking about Daniel, wondering where his wanderings had taken him and whether he had found the healing he sought. She caught herself scanning the horizon whenever she was outside, half hoping to see a familiar figure on a painted horse approaching across the grassland. It was Thomas who first sensed Daniel's return 3 months after their arrival at the ranch. The baby, now sitting up on his own and showing signs of the intelligence Daniel had predicted, suddenly became alert and focused while playing on a blanket outside the house. He stared fixedly toward the eastern horizon, making excited sounds that drew Sarah's attention. Following her son's gaze, Sarah saw a lone rider approaching across the prairie. Even at a distance, she recognized the fluid grace of Daniel's riding style and the distinctive markings of his painted horse. Her heart began to race with an excitement she didn't want to examine too closely. Daniel looked different when he finally reached the ranch house. The haunted expression that had shadowed his eyes during their first meeting was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. He dismounted and approached Sarah with the same quiet dignity she remembered, but there was a lightness about him that hadn't been there before. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, "about what you said when we parted, about having a purpose." Thomas reached toward Daniel with obvious recognition and delight, and the man's face softened as he took the baby in his arms. There was something natural about the way they interacted, as if they shared a connection that transcended their brief previous acquaintance. "I've decided to settle down," Daniel continued, looking at Sarah over Thomas's head. "I've been offered work as a guide and translator for the territorial government, helping to negotiate with the Indian tribes. It's based out of Great Falls, and it would allow me to use my knowledge to help both sides understand each other." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "That sounds like important work," she managed to say. "It is," Daniel agreed. "But more than that, it feels right. For the first time since my family died, I can see a future that makes sense." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a vulnerability that Sarah had never heard from him before. "I was hoping that future might include you and Thomas if you're interested in building something together." It was a proposal that went beyond mere marriage, an invitation to create a life that honored both their losses and their hopes for the future. Sarah looked at this man who had saved their lives and then given them the space to build new ones, who possessed abilities that challenged everything she thought she knew about the world, and who seemed to see qualities in her son that no one else could perceive. "Yes," she said simply. The wedding took place 2 months later, a small ceremony performed by the circuit preacher who served the scattered ranches of the territory. Margaret and Robert stood as witnesses, and Thomas, now almost a year old, and displaying the unusual alertness Daniel had predicted, seemed to approve of the proceedings with serious baby dignity. Daniel proved to be everything Sarah had hoped for in a second husband, and more. He brought to their marriage a depth of wisdom earned through suffering, a connection to the natural world that enriched their daily lives, and a gentle strength that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't experienced since James's death. Most remarkably, he formed an immediate and profound bond with Thomas, treating the boy as if he were his own son. Under Daniel's guidance, Thomas began to display abilities that confirmed his stepfather's early predictions. The child seemed to understand animals in a way that went beyond normal human capacity, calming frightened horses with a touch and attracting wild birds that would perch on his tiny hands. As he learned to walk and talk, it became clear that he saw and heard things that were invisible to other people. "Is this what you meant when you said he was special?" Sarah asked Daniel one evening as they watched 2-year-old Thomas having what appeared to be a serious conversation with a family of rabbits that had taken up residence near their garden. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "He has the gift, stronger than anyone I've ever seen. The question is what he'll choose to do with it as he grows up." "Will you teach him?" "I'll teach him what I know," Daniel replied. "But his path will be his own to choose. The old ways are changing as more settlers come to the territory. He'll need to find ways to use his gifts that make sense in the new world that's coming." Sarah watched her son communicate with creatures that should have fled from human contact, and she felt a mixture of pride and concern for the extraordinary life that lay ahead of him. Whatever challenges Thomas would face, she knew he would face them with the strength he had inherited from both his fathers and the wisdom Daniel would pass on to him. Years later, when Thomas had grown into a man whose reputation as a guide and mediator between human and animal communities had spread throughout the territory, Sarah would often think about the day a charging bison herd had brought them together with Daniel. It had seemed like the end of everything at the time, a moment of pure terror that threatened to destroy the fragile new life she was trying to build for herself and her son. Instead, it had been a beginning, the first chapter in a story that would span decades and touch the lives of countless people who would benefit from Thomas's unique gifts and Daniel's accumulated wisdom. The wilderness that had nearly killed them had instead given them exactly what they needed, at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way. Sometimes, Sarah reflected, the spirits did indeed work in mysterious ways, weaving together the threads of individual lives to create patterns of meaning that were only visible from a distance. The bison herd that had threatened to trample them had instead carried them toward a destiny none of them could have imagined, a future built on the foundation of shared loss, mutual healing, and the extraordinary possibilities that existed at the intersection of the natural and supernatural worlds. In her final years, Sarah would tell this story to her grandchildren, watching their eyes grow wide with wonder and disbelief. They would ask if it was really true, if such things were really possible, and she would smile and tell them that the world was far more mysterious and magical than most people ever realized. All they had to do was be open to the possibilities and trust that sometimes, when everything seemed lost, help would come from the most unexpected places in the most extraordinary ways.